After working on Swiftguard for over a year, I finally got to hold my first playtest of the system. I got to see what worked, what needed some tweaking, and what might have to be scrapped altogether. Hi, I'm John, and this is Dragon Mind, where we discover our best selves through gaming, and today we're going to be unpacking the player feedback I got from running my first playtest of my TTRPG, Swiftguard. Let's get into it. Okay, before diving into the feedback itself, I feel like I need to set the context for how the playtest was run. First, I was the GM with 4 of my regular players, who are veteran 5e players. I didn't really have to teach them the game's basic mechanics. We more got to focus on the little changes that I made from the base version of 5e. Including the action economy, the advantage system. I even got to see what happens when they drop to 0 and have to start making death saves. But all this is to say that this is far from an unbiased sample. They all want to see me succeed. I'm the game's designer, so it's not like I'm trying to unpack all of this for the first time. And there are some things that are new to Swiftguard that we've been playing with for a while, like facing and additional opportunity attack triggers. So that's all to say that this playtest was probably smoother than the average one would be. Second, I just ran Playtest Adventure 1, the one that I have linked in the description below. Now, while running it, I did notice there were some errors, like there were some incorrect initiative calculations with some of the stat blocks, and even the pre-made character sheets had little things that were wrong with them. But I did my best to stick with the adventure as written. Obviously, my players came up with some ideas that I had never even considered, so there was a little bit of improv. But for the most part, I ran the adventure as is, with the one mistake being I forgot that I had prepared 6 bandits for the first encounter, and I accidentally threw 2 more at them. And that was by far the most difficult combat of the entire night. But they survived, and it actually gave me the chance to see what happens when player characters drop to 0. And third, I had my players pick from the pre-made archetypes that are included with the adventure rather than creating their own characters. For our next playtest, we'll dive into the character creation system, but I wanted to see if the archetypes are balanced against each other and if they were intuitive and made sense, because the whole point of them is to offer simpler builds that new players can just pick up and understand relatively easily. Now that being said, these players did not pick a traditionally balanced party. For archetypes, I had a hunter, a saint, a warden, and a recluse. In other words, they had a glass cannon damage dealer, a debuff expert, and 2 support/healer types. So they didn't have anyone that had a lot of big AoE damage, and they didn't take a tank. So with that context established, let's get into what they had to say. First, the good. Right off the bat, all of them loved the 3 action economy. And I do want to say that 3 of these 4 playtest players playtested Pathfinder 2nd Edition with me, which also had a 3 action economy. But because that 3 action economy is balanced, assuming that all 3 actions are always equal, there are these balanced decisions that are made, like the multiple attack penalty or every spell costing 2 actions, that made my players not really like it. However, by having the main balance be the main action, players were free to think about how they wanted to spend their other 2 actions. I had a lot of moving, hiding, and taking cover, which I don't see a lot in 5e. The one they really liked was the guard action, so they felt like even if they missed with a melee attack, they could just guard and defend themselves. Now, one thing I didn't really like was that in the first fight, especially because there were a lot of bandit minions, they ended up getting surrounded and kind of stuck in melee for a little bit. And a lot of times on their turns, they'd use a main action to cast a spell or make a weapon attack. They'd use an action to guard, but then they really wouldn't spend their 3rd action because they didn't have a lot of options. I think as characters get higher in level, they'll be able to acquire 3rd action features, but I want them to make the most of the action economy right away. At the end of the game, I mentioned this to them, and they said, hey, in 5e, a lot of times, you either succeed or you fail, and then when you fail, your turn feels wasted. At least with guard, there's like an extra thing you can do, as well as move around a little easier and hide a lot more effectively. So with all that design being considered, I'm thinking about making disengage, which right now is a main action, into just an action. And maybe even adding a help-like reaction, where like if you're next to an enemy, you can react and be like, hey, over here, and grant another player advantage. Speaking of which, the advantage system is something they also loved. With 5e's roll 2d20, take the higher, yes, that is a simpler, streamlined way of running advantage that I think a lot of new players like. My problem with it is that it's way too big a bonus for way too little of a cost, especially with the 2024 rules. I mean, you're practically doubling your crit chances, as well as functionally adding like a +4 to the roll. It seems like too much for too little. Now, I like having it easy to let players give themselves advantage, and by using smart tactics to give themselves a greater chance to succeed. So having them roll a d4 to a d20, it just felt tighter and it just kind of felt more right. And there were a few times where they got to stack sources of advantage and roll a d6. It never got more than 2 though. And even then, I started to see the concerns about how unwieldy it is to start tracking 4 or 5 sources of advantage. So for our next playtest, I think the thing I'm going to kind of play around with is having there be 3 stages of advantage, and having the advantage die start as a d4, increase to a d8, and top out at a d12. We'll see how that works, and if my players still like it just as much. Oh, little thing with advantage, I also forgot how I designed guard. For a while, I was tinkering with this idea of having guard add a +2 bonus to your AC for attacks you can see. So if an enemy gets behind you to your rear flank, you don't get the bonus from guard that way. However, after some consideration, I was starting to think, that floating +2, I think it'll add some confusion, or it's just one more thing to track. So I designed it more like 5e's dodge, where attacks against someone on guard have disadvantage, again, unless they get into your blind spot. But I forgot that and was just like, guard adds a +2 AC. And my players had no trouble keeping track of it. I do want to still playtest the disadvantage version, just to see how it interacts with the advantage system. But the +2 AC seemed to work just fine for my players, so I might turn it back, depending on how the B testing goes. But yeah, just closing this loop, I think my players like the advantage system enough that it's worth keeping even if it needs tweaking. Now, one other thing they responded really positively to, that I didn't include in my overview video, is the new spell casting system. Rather than spell slots, the resource that gets spent for spellcasters are mana points. Just like a video game, your spellcasters have MP, and they can spend MP to cast spells. Rather than like a 1 spell slot per turn rule, like in D&D 2024, each character also has a max mana output, which essentially is like an upper limit to how many mana points they can spend per turn. Their feedback was exactly what I wanted to hear, which is, this is so much easier and so much more flexible. Their one complaint is that a lot of spells they felt cost too many mana points. Even after I explained to them that in 5e, you only really get 2 spells at first level, they still wanted more. So my compromise here, I've already gone into playtest packet 2. A lot of the spells cost less mana points, but also start a little weaker, and you can still spend additional mana points in order to make them more powerful. So that way, if players do want to cast more weaker versions of spells, it's at least an option. Now the criticism. First, this isn't something they said, it was just something I noticed. There were times I was looking at how the archetypes moved, and I was like, I should build them a little differently. For example, the Hunter, I had originally conceived using the Efficient Stride ability, and actually even in the playtest adventure it mentions, if you have characters that have Efficient Stride, they'll move easier in certain terrain. Instead, I had given the Hunter archetype the Concealed Attack ability, so that if they were sneak attacking, they wouldn't be revealing their position. And while I still like that ability, I just think archetypally for how I want the archetypes to be presented in relation to the playtest adventures, I think a Fish and Stride matches better. In addition, I do think that giving each archetype some sort of third action ability would help just make the 3 action economy feel a little more fulfilling. But again, these are nitpicks against myself. A huge piece of criticism was just how devastating death saves are. In Swiftguard, when you drop to 0, you start acquiring wounds, and for each wound, your hit point maximum drops by 1/4. And the Warden actually got hit so much, at one point they had 3 wounds, meaning they only had like 3 or 4 hit points at maximum. Now, for short rests, players can use charges of a healing kit to remove a wound and gain a level of exhaustion. So after the first fight, the Warden had a -4 to all of their rolls as well as their spell save DC. And they miraculously made it through the adventure, but still, this was a very punishing system, and I don't think my players were quite ready for it. One of them was like, yeah, I don't like how punishing it was, but I get the fact that in 5e, dropping to 0 basically doesn't mean anything. And I was just listening to an episode of the Eldritch Lorecast where they were talking about this topic, and so instead, what I thought about this morning as a possible solution, one that I at least want to playtest, is similar to the death moves in Daggerheart. In fact, with Rel's system, Distal, in an earlier playtest version, he had death actions which were similar to death moves, so at least for a player that was knocked out to 0, they could do something, and I think that this could be a neat system. The number one thing I just don't like about 0 hit points knocking you unconscious, it really comes back to the fact that that player isn't playing the game anymore. And so it's a tricky balance trying to figure out how they can participate while also making dropping to 0 something you don't want. So yeah, I'll be thinking on this in the future. And that's the playtest for both Playtest Packet 1.2 and Playtest Adventure 1. There are definitely a lot of little things that need to be adjusted. But first things first, I want to just make sure that Playtest Adventure 1 gets updated with a lot of little fixes so that it's easier to play. You may notice there might be conflicts in the edited version of Playtest Adventure 1, like one of the things we decided on, heal as a main action, better as just one action with a lower mana point cost. So if you see a conflict from Playtest Adventure 1 with Playtest Packet 1.2, just to edit your playtest packet to match what's in the adventure in those cases, it'll be reflected once I actually release Playtest Packet 2, which is going to have a whole lot of overhauled content. So for now, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. I'd really appreciate a like, subscribe, ring that little notification bell. Have an awesome day, everybody. Bye-bye now.